Hey everybody, we're moving on to General Wade Hampton. I promised that video this week, and we're getting to it. Um, General Wade Hampton the third. He was the third one. Um, and as I get into his history, which is mainly Civil War and the Confederacy, we'll talk about his family and how they evolved. Okay, General Wade Hampton was born March 28, 1818, and he died April 11th, 1902. He was born in Charleston, South Carolina. He came from a wealthy farming family. But not only were they farmers, they were also involved deeply in the military. And shortly before the war, General Wade Hampton was a South Carolina state representative. During the Civil War, he attained the rank of Lieutenant General, that's 3 stars, of the Confederate cavalry. He was in charge of all of the cavalry. That's horse soldiers. At the end of the Reconstruction era and the withdrawal of federal troops, this is shortly after the Civil War, because I'm gonna bounce back and forth because in order to understand him, you have to know different aspects, and some of it may have been after the Civil War, some of it may have been right during the Civil War, and some before. So at the end of the Reconstruction era, that was a period of years after the Civil War to rebuild all the cities and that kind of thing. He became a member of the Redeemers. The Redeemers is the southern wing of the Democrat Party. He owned slaves. His campaign for governor of South Carolina was marked by violence by the red shirts. The red shirts was the early days of the KKK, or the Ku Klux Klan. It was a white supremacist group, a forerunner to the KKKs, like I just said. He was elected governor, and he served of South Carolina, and he served from 1876 to 1879, and then he served 2 terms as a U.S. Senator from 1879 to 1891. He was born in Charleston, South Carolina. He was the oldest son of a U.S. Army officer. That would be Colonel Wade Hampton II. Colonel Wade Hampton was born in 1791 and died in 1858. After the War of 1812, Colonel Hampton was an officer of during the War of 1812. During the War of 1812, that was the second war with Britain, Great Britain. He was an officer of the Dragoons and was an aide to General Andrew Jackson at the Battle of New Orleans. His grandfather, Lieutenant Colonel Wade Hampton I, was born in 1754 and died in 1835. He was a cavalry officer in the Revolutionary War, and also served in the U.S. House of Representatives, and rose to the rank of Brigadier General. That's 1 star. In the War of 1812. Okay. General Wade Hampton III also had an uncle by marriage called James Henry Hammonds. He served in the House of Representatives, was also the governor, and served in the U.S. Senate as well. As a young boy, General Wade Hampton III was known to hunt black bear with just a knife. And historical accounts credit him with killing 80 bears with just a knife. He was a bear fighter. Tough man. It takes a tough man to stand up to a bear. In 1836, he graduated South Carolina College, that is now the University in South Carolina, and studied law, although he never practiced as a lawyer. When the Civil War broke out, he resigned from the U.S. Senate to enlist as a private in the South Carolina militia. Now, if you remember the Camp Croft video, we talked about the South Carolina militia, and that one marker had South Carolina militia. General Wade Hampton would have been his commanding officer. When he organized, the governor commissioned him as a colonel. Now, back in those days, scholars and businessmen, they had skills that regular little farmers didn't have, and they were commissioned as officers because they had went to school, or because they had some sort of, like, if a man ran a general store and he enlisted into the army, well, they put him in the quartermaster's corps because he knew how to supply stuff. Like I said, the governor then commissioned him as a colonel. All right, so he went from private to colonel in like a couple of days. He organized and partially funded the unit known as Hampton's Legion. That was what his unit of cavalry was called, the Hampton's Legion. And it consisted of 6 infantry companies, 4 cavalry companies, and 1 battery of artillery. And he paid for all of the weapons from his own pocket. You got to remember, when we were fighting the Civil War, the Union wasn't going to give us weapons. They wasn't going to give the South any weapons. So, people turned in rifles so the militia could have them and stuff like that, Plantations cut the iron railings off of their plantation houses, main houses, to melt down to make cannonballs out of it. That story is common here in South Carolina and probably other parts of the South too. So he paid for all the weapons out of his own pocket just so he could field his army. His first combat was in the First Battle of Manassas, where a bullet creased his head as he charged a Union artillery position. He then fought at the Siege of Yorktown and at the Battle of Seven Pines, where he was severely wounded in the foot. He nearly lost his leg. General Lee reorganized all cavalry forces as a division under Jeb Stuart, while Hampton's brigade was left behind in Northern Virginia to ensure the Northern troops pulled out after the Yorktown battle. See, they got defeated there. So he left them there. The general was convalescing in a field hospital, probably, if not home. But his unit stayed behind as a defense force to make sure the British were in fact leaving. After the Chambersburg raid in October of 1862, Hampton was appointed the military governor of the town following its surrender. That winter, Hampton's troops raided behind enemy lines and captured troops and supplies, earning a commendation from General Lee. See, one thing they had to steal and raid and get was weapons and ammunition, medical supplies, food, because not everybody in the South, you got to keep in mind, not everybody in the South wanted, the South was torn apart. You didn't know who to trust, even in your own town. Your neighbor might be fighting for the Union. So it was a contested time in America, in its infancy, I like to say, or at least its toddlerhood. In November of 1862, he captured 137 men without ever firing a shot. How you do that? Hey, leave it to a man who fights bears with just a knife, and you figure it out. He was wounded for the third time at the Battle of Brandy Station, and his brother was killed there. I guess it would be his younger brother, since he was the oldest. He was wounded a fourth time at Gettysburg, and a fifth time a few days later by a saber cut to the head. The only troops that carried sabers in the Civil War were officers. So he got into a duel with an opposing officer and got slashed in the head, but he survived. And then again, a man that can fight bears and kill 80 bears with just a knife, that's a tough son of a gun, man. He was wounded a sixth time by artillery shrapnel to the hip and sent to Virginia to heal. In 1863, he was promoted to Major General and eventually surrendered to the North in Durham, North Carolina. After the war, he got into politics. He was offered the nomination of governor in 1865, but he turned it down because he believed Northerners would naturally be suspicious of a former Confederate general serving as governor. So he campaigned to ask people to get this. He campaigned as if he was gonna run, but instead of asking people to vote for him, he was asking people not to vote for him. So he campaigned, but he was telling people, don't vote for me. Which, that in itself, I found that pretty comical, because I wish a few politicians today would ask people not to vote for him. In 1868, he became chairman of the Democrat Party in South Carolina and raised money to support the KKK and other groups calling themselves rifle clubs. Everybody knew what the KK was back then, and the red shirts. If you remember the movie The Outlaw Josie Wells, they called them red legs. But the red shirts was the same thing. They just hunted people down they didn't like and they killed them. After politics in 1893 to 1897, he served on the U.S. Railroad Commission. And you got to remember, in that time frame, if you remember your history, they were building the railroad across America out the west by then. So he was doing something good for the country then. So, and he was appointed by President Grover Cleveland. In 1890, his niece Caroline and her husband, who was a surgeon, invented the surgical gloves to protect the skin for surgery chemicals and infections. So we have surgical gloves today because of a Hampton niece. Probably one of his other brother's daughter. General Wade Hampton died in Columbia, South Carolina in 1902, and he's buried at the Trinity Cathedral Churchyard in downtown Columbia. The Sons of the Confederacy, what that is down here in the South Carolina, I might have to explain to some people. There's Sons of the Confederacy is like the Sons of the Revolution. They're descendants of people that actually served in those wars. The Sons of the Confederacy awarded General Hampton the Confederate Medal of Honor in 1977. The other day, I went out and I filmed, there is a marker on the side of the road, U.S. Highway 29. between Spartanburg and Greenville, there's a small community that sits right on the border, and half of it is in Greenville County and half of it is in Spartanburg County. He had some family that lived there. And the Cherokee Indians, I don't want to give too much away, basically the Cherokee Indians wiped out that family. And there's a marker on the side of the road that tells about that, and also tells a little bit about the general and his dad. And I'm gonna put that video in this. But I hope you take a look at some of the history of South Carolina, and it's very important to me because, you know, you got to ask yourself, if we erase history, I mean, how do you know where you're going if you don't know where you came from? That's why history is so important, you know. And when the people who served, like right now, we're the greatest generation, those World War II veterans, they're almost extinct. Almost extinct. You got to talk to these people, and you got to find out the history of, that's what leads up to today. So if you can learn from the past, you won't make the same mistake in the future. And that's why it's important to me. Of course, I've always been sort of into history. History was my best subject in high school. I could remember dates pretty easy. I got a photographic memory. If I read a book about something, I pretty much knew it. It's not that way anymore as I'm getting older. Sometimes I have to look stuff up, but I know main dates. You know, it's like a lot of people think we, as Americans, 4th of July is our Independence Day. No, it's not. That's just the day that the Declaration of Independence was signed and mailed to King George over in Britain. That was the we ain't taking your crap no more letter. That's what that was. No taxation without equal representation. We didn't gain independence until fighting nearly a 13-year war with Great Britain. Broken up into two different little wars, which was 1776 to about we didn't actually gain independence until 1786, I believe, 89. 13 years. That's how long it took to gain independence. And basically, we just wore the British out. Especially down here in the South, they didn't know what to make of the swamps. They couldn't handle the heat. They didn't want to fight in the South. The British didn't. They wanted to fight in the North. That's why a lot of the battles took place in the North. It's a lot cooler up there when you're wearing wool uniforms. But I hope you've enjoyed this little bit of history. Since I mentioned Senator Strom Thurmond and his lengthy military career, but he also had a very lengthy political career just like this. And another thing, which brings me up to the next point of view. Whenever you hear Southerners talk about, oh, they come from old money, General Wade Hampton came from old money. That's what we mean by old money. If you hear it down here in the South, that's what we mean. Old money means they've had money in that family since they got here, since the 1700s. In 1775, they gauged a man's wealth by how much land he owned or claimed, and how many slaves he owned or claimed. That's how it was. But anyways, I hope you enjoyed it, and I'm going to see if I'm going to try something new and try to splice in that other film into this one and see, just make one big one. But if it don't work, there'll be two parts. Anyways, y'all have a good evening.